I am having an absolute mare with the lighting in this studio on this box. I'm trying to find the right spot. It's either there and it's too dark and you can't really see it, or it's over here and basically it looks like it's going to catch fire any second. I'm going to bring that over there. So I'm going to try and find the sweet spot, whether it's for the thumbnail or just for this SSD. I hope for the best, but I apologise in advance if during the course of this video I blind any of you. That's it. It's the disclaimer. You can't sue me. Hello and welcome back, and that is right, we're looking at another AdLink SSD, part of their A series, the AdGame series, and this is the A90. This is kind of their middle of the ground SSD for PS5 users. So we've got this right here. I've already looked at chronologically, I'm still wearing the shirt, the A95 here. This is their premium grade one with the highest quality NAND, the highest performance overall, the highest IOPS, basically the big daddy SSD, which is also the most expensive. And then at the other end, you've got the A92 series, which is kind of weird chronologically, but we'll get to that another time. The A92 here at the other end, which uses QLC NAND that we will review and bench test in a while. But this SSD prioritizes capacity over performance. So again, performance and capacity, but also expensive. High capacity, lower performance, lower price. And there in the middle of all of this is this one here. This is the A90. Now the A90 has a reported benchmark of 5,000 megabytes per second sequential read and 4,400 megabytes per second sequential write. Now, a number of you, although this video is not targeting specifics of PS5 too much today, I'm going to do dedicated PS5 videos on each of these and then compare them in a giant comparison. It is worth highlighting in this video that that benchmark is technically lower than Sony's own recommended minimum of 5,500 megabytes per second sequential read, which is the maximum performance of the internal PS5 SSD. Now, if you do pop this inside a PS5, however, the PS5 rates this much higher. Indeed, AdLink themselves have done bench testing and do highlight that this does go higher than the recommended minimum from the PS5's own internal benchmark testing and how it formats and interacts with the drive. So the solidity of that recommended minimum is actually a bit wavy. In all of my testing that I did of testing different SSDs, I tested some SSDs that, according to reported benchmarks from the brands themselves, of around 4,100 megabytes per second. Not this one, but that's when we were looking at the Q4 from Sabrin. That SSD was still rated higher than 6,000 on the PS5. So again, there's something about the PS5's internal benchmark which doesn't quite fit with traditional benchmarks in how it interacts with the drive. Ergo, this drive is still on a compatible list. And today we are going to be doing benchmarks with AJA, with Crystal Disk, with Atto, with AS SSD, and generally trying to find out how much this can prove its own abilities. And of course, the dedicated PS5 content down the line. Hey guys, so when I was doing the review of this SSD and I was doing the editing for it, much like the other A series from AdLink, I thought it appropriate to include just a brief benchmark there on the PS5 because I know a number of you are looking at this SSD as the next storage upgrade for your PlayStation 5. So I just wanted to quickly switch over and give you a quick benchmark using the PlayStation's own setup. I'm going to do a full test on this, but I just wanted to include it here in the post-production, the post-edit there. So let's format this SSD and show what exactly the PS5 benchmarks this SSD at. So it's benchmarking it at 5,636, which is pretty much what their own specification pages do rate this SSD at. So at least not only do we know that this SSD that by conventional benchmarks is less than the PS5 recommended minimum still works, but also the fact that that benchmark that they are listing on their own website, that's AdLink for the A series, is indeed correct. So what I'm going to do now is make my way into the Storage Manager real quick before we return to the review. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and continue the review where we talk about the specifications and those PC benchmarking tools. But as you see there, the SSD has appeared, and there you go. This is the AdLink working perfectly on the PS5, at least as far as benchmarks go. But let's leave that to the video where we overview it and return to the review. So again, it is worth highlighting, as I've mentioned this in previous videos, this is one of the few SSDs I've had here on the channel, and the lighting isn't going to absolutely betray me, that is PS5 branded. They are one of the first brands out there to release you know, an SSD for PS5. This is kind of built on the architecture of the S series, so it was the S95, S90, S92. But in the A series, they've optimized the NAND in some areas. They've kind of tweaked things to be a little bit better as well, particularly in terms of sequential read, resulting in this drive, and indeed the whole series, being a little bit more PS5 targeted. Now, if we open this up and have a look what we get for our money, we'll get to see that lovely little heatsink. Now, we've got our information there on our 5-year warranty, as well as first time setup there. The lighting betrayed me once again. But what I will say about this is, firstly, you're not really going to use this guide that much. And two, you don't really need a guide for this, because one of the few things about this SSD that already left a lasting impression very early doors, even before it arrived here in the studio, is that heatsink. I really like it. Now, one might argue this is not a PS5 optimized heatsink, because again, this is a heatsink that I think is classically better designed for a PC chassis. I think it is a very nice heatsink. I think it does an incredible job of spacing out and making sure the chips, you can see those tiny gaps there, if I get that right, between each of the key components and the heatsink. It makes sure to really target the specific chips as much as possible while giving great aerial density, as well as having raised vents all the way through and channeling vents all the way. It is a good heatsink, but it is a heatsink that's a lot more multi-purpose than, say, the Sabrent one we talked about in the past, which is specifically for PS5. Now, we will, of course, be doing temperature tests with that heatsink down the line as well. But one thing I will add with this heatsink very early doors is, when I was getting ready for this series of videos using all of these, I wanted to take a closer look at the chips inside. I wanted to have a look at the NAND. I wanted to see the distribution of it. So I had to get that heatsink off of there. And I damn near ripped my nails out, because this is a very, very well attached heatsink. Not because of any clips. It's not clipped to the SSD in any shape or form. But they're using a more putty-based silicon heat gel inside rather than those thermal stretchy pads, which is really, really good. It finds a fine line between heat dissipation connection with the chips to the heatsink. There has to be that cellular gel between the components and the heatsink to enable the dissipation of heat flow to the metal panel. But it arrives in such this nice soft form that it wraps around the chips. It isn't just touching them, it actually slightly overlaps onto the chips. Now, again, I've already removed this heatsink, so it will come off a great deal easier this time, but trust me, that little gesture there took me the better part of 5 minutes outside of this video. And if we have a little look, you can see there at the base of it there, the indentations of each of those chips. And the little dents you can see are where a lot of the putty still remains on that SSD, as you can see there. So again, this isn't using a normal thermal pad. This properly embeds the chips and sinks into it. So on the one hand, they've gone with one strip of silicon, of thermal padding between them, like a lot of brands, but at the same time, it wraps around the chips in a really pleasing way and make sure that heat dissipation is maximized as much as possible. So again, fair play, that is a very, very good heatsink. And another example of why it's always preferable to go for a heatsink that arrives with the SSD pre-attached. They just do a better job. So if we remove that heatsink, let's have a little look at this. Now, this is the 2TB model, but it utilizes a double-sided architecture. So right there in the middle, it's got the Phison E16 controller, so not the E18. It's the previous generation from that, but this doesn't need to go much higher than that. At the top there, we have got some DDR4 memory, and that's 2 DDR4 SD-RAM chips there, either side, SK Hynix. And of course, the NAND that's distributed all the way around this SSD. There's 4 chips there, and that is 96-layer Micron 3D TLC NAND. Now, according to Adlink, I chatted to them a little bit when I was talking about the other SSDs. They are hoping that later manufactured units of this will also move on to the 176-layer NANDs there, which, let's be honest, it's long overdue. It's been, 176 Micron NAND. You get not only better performance, but a better disbursement of performance and capacity throughout the SSD. And only really Fire, CUDA, and about 2 other brands, including AdLink, have actually moved away from 96 layer NAND. So although this has got 96 layer NAND on top of it, I'm glad that they're able to clarify that they're going to move up to the other quality and density of 3D TLC NAND later in future releases for this. It's also worth highlighting that the performance benchmarks on this SSD, if we have a quick look there, I know there's like muck there from all that the thermal on there. The performance benchmarks for this SSD, they peak out at 5,000 megabytes per second for each of the individual capacities, of which there are 1 and 2 TBs. The 1 and 2 TB capacity arrive at $179 and $349 at 1 and 2 TB respectively. It takes advantage, of course, of PCIe Gen 4x4, potential 8,000 megabytes per second throughput on that bandwidth, and of course this maxing out at 5,000. I'm willing to bet it will cross into 5152, but that's what we'll find out in the benchmark testing. Has NVMe 1.3 revision there, so again, we're not using 1.4 on this, but again, because of that Phison controller, that's not a huge surprise. The sequential write on this goes up to 4,400 megabytes per second. I think the highest out there for this kind of architecture is 4,900, so it's very much on the cusp of that, but we will be comparing that later on in the benchmarks. In terms of IOPS performance, it's 750,000, 4K IOPS over 700,000 IOPS there. So again, read, write respectively, lovely stuff. Durability is somewhere where I can give a big old tick, because this SSD arrives with 0.98, so effectively 1.0 drive writes per day, which means you can fully populate this SSD every single day almost, with the 2 TB arriving with a terabytes written of 3,600, so again getting close, 1.98, and the 1 TB at 1,800 terabytes written. A lot of information to keep in the old noodle there. So again, for a mid-range, mid-series SSD living there in between the two of these, that is some impressive benchmarking there. So it's going to be really interesting to see, with that price point being, you know, a lot more affordable than the A95, whether those benchmarks are going to be, you know, good enough and live up to what they're promising here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this SSD, we're going to get it into the test machine and run all of our tests. Do bear in mind, we are utilizing a 6-core i5 11th gen processor inside this machine, 16 gig of DDR4 memory, no GPU on board. We will be using a dedicated PCIe Gen 4x4 1.4 revision slot. There'll be no benchmarking there. We're going to look at temperature as well later in the video, but it's worth highlighting that a lot of the benchmarks supplied by AdLink were done on an 8-core, I believe, Xeon or Xenon processor there. So that is some beefy stuff to live up to. So if this can hit the same benchmarks, I'll be pleased, but I won't be surprised if I fall ever so slightly short. But for now, let's make our way to the test machine. Right, so here we are on the test screen, and the first thing that struck me about this SSD as soon as it was installed is how it compared in terms of temperature versus that of the A95 that I've tested recently. So there is the temperature there. It's a fairly consistent thread. You can see there starting at 30. It ended up kind of entering that kind of realms of the 34, 35 there. I've not done much other than setting up the SSD for the very first time. And indeed, if we make our way into the computer manager here, you can see that I've added that SSD, the A90, and on top of that, we can make our way into, where is it, the PC here. We're testing on that 11th Gen i5, and again, that is a 16 gig memory DDR4 there in conjunction with that 6-core processor. So this is not utilizing the same high-end test machine that AdLink utilized in their own testing, as you can see there, and it is the middle tally we're looking at, but they suggest that this 2 TB drive should be hitting 5,000 megabytes per second and 4,400 megabytes per second in our test. Now, again, this is utilizing that E16 controller, the Phison E16, and throughout our test, we will be running the following programs. We'll be looking at, first and foremost, Crystal Disk. Ignore the black screen there. That's because I'm going into admin settings every time. We'll be running 3 tests on Crystal Disk. We'll also be running 3 tests on ASSSD. We'll be running 3 tests on Atto Disk Benchmark there. And finally, 3 tests on AJA. It is worth remembering during the course of these tests that I'm not able to screen record these tests as I am utilising OBS, the capture software. So the result is that when I am running those tests, they're all going to be done and you're only going to see the results of those tests. If I try to run them, I'll give an example now. We'll go with a 4 GB test file here. You'll see there at the bottom that the performance benchmarks are messy as hell. And the reason that is because the system is already utilising quite a lot of resources while running screen recording and capture software, which then plays its part on kind of capping the performance a little bit. I could use a capture card, of course, an external capture card, but I'm already utilising that in my workflow for all that PS5 performance benchmark software content. So do stay tuned for that, but for now what I'm going to do is run all of these tests. It takes around an hour to an hour and a half with a 1 minute gap between each test to allow the system to cool down, and at the end I'm going to show you guys all of the performance benchmarks of all of that software, 3 tests per software, and of course how that's affected the temperature from the test. It's just before 12 noon, so this should end around about 1:30. So let's fast forward to the completion of those tests. Right, so testing has completed and there's a few things to take away immediately. For those that aren't aware, we've already conducted and hopefully published the review and benchmark of the A95, the kind of higher tier version of the AdLink gaming series, and of course we're looking at the A90. But one of the biggest differences between these two SSDs that I noticed very early doors was the temperature at which these SSDs were achieving. So as these tests were conducted for, around about an hour, we can have a little look here at the benchmark there. And this was pretty much every temperature high during the course of the test. So what we would do is we'd run a test, such as AJA or Atto, and then we'd leave the system idle for around about a minute before we conducted another test. It gave the system time to dissipate that heat, and it gave us a good understanding of what the average temperature of this would be for moderate use. Now, right there we can see that it peaked out at the very highest point at around 64 degrees, and there was a through line there of around 43 all the way through on average. But if we have a little look along here and we go to our results that we tested before while we're looking at the A95, we can definitely see something to look at here. And that is, as you can see, the tests were relatively similar in the way they were conducted. I think I conducted the Atto disk benchmark in a different order, hence the spike being different. But look at that average difference there. On the AdLink there, you can see that the average there was just under 30. It maintained the temperature very, very well. Whereas in the A90, you can see that the temperature there did get higher and the average heat was a degree higher. Now, I was a little surprised by that and I was looking into it, so some of the tests I reconducted, but for the most part, it did seem that this was the temperature at which this SSD would operate. Another thing, it did drop in temperature just as quickly. As you can see, even though the most recent test ended around about 4 minutes ago, the temperature had already gone down to 41. So once again, that heat sink that these AdLink SSDs arrive with is very, very, very good for dissipating heat, and no doubt partly thanks to the way that the thermal gel has been applied between the heatsink and those chips. But it's still worth highlighting that it did seem to get a pinch hotter than what we saw in the A95. Neither one of these temperatures is by any means critical. In fact, they're both within very reasonable operating parameters, but still nonetheless it was worth highlighting that point. Now, as the tests were completed, I've got to tell you right now that for the most part, all of these benchmarks were hit. Even though we're not utilising the highfalutin 8-core Xeon test machine that AdLink used in their tests, we did get moderately close with our 6-core 11th Gen i5 system here. So first test we're going to look at is the easiest to read, and that is of course Crystal Disk. As you can see, we've got a 1 gig, a 4 gig and a 16 gigabyte test file. Now in the 4 gig test file we did exceed that 5000 there, but we got incredibly close there, just a few megabytes off in terms of read performance on the 1 and the 16 gig as well. Indeed, we can see that the IOPS there comfortably, in terms of read at least, did get close to that 700,000 IOPS there, although write performance did dip somewhat, and we noticed as we went for the larger files, this is going to be a consistent trend in this review, that we did saturate that memory quite consistently. So again, you do notice a drop there that we're going to highlight more and more later on. It's something that no gamer is really going to have to worry about. But if you were constantly bombarding this SSD, that may present something of a dip in performance relatively soon. But gamers, nothing to worry about. Now, moving away from Crystal Disk there on those 3 different file format sizes, we can make our way into Atto Disk Benchmark. Once again, we used 3 different file sizes here. First thing we're going to look at, let's get rid of that, is the general throughput performance there. And as you can see, if we overlap these ever so slightly, we're able to see there that there is a consistent thread between them. And again, in terms of write, getting to the very, very, very high 3.9 gigabyte, crossing occasionally into the 4 gigabytes. And then, of course, in read, comfortably exceeding that 5,000 megabytes or 5 gigabytes consistently through the test. And if we flick into IOPS on all 3 of these, we can see that the IOPS between them still consistently high and fairly comparable all the way through the testing. And again, this is that consistent trend. Although these aren't the smallest file size that we could be utilizing, I wanted to keep it fair across the tests. And even in these file sizes, it's worth highlighting, you can definitely see that the SSD got a little bit oversaturated towards the end of each barrage of tests. Perhaps if I'd left a longer period of time for the drive to reacclimate, perhaps that would have been different, but I don't think that would have been fair comparing against other SSDs. Now, if we come out of Atto Disk Benchmark, we can make our way into ASSSD, and again, we looked at general throughput and IOPS, and again, as I've mentioned in many videos, ASSSD is a little bit more of a tougher benchmark to work through. It does a lot of consistent simultaneous tests, and indeed, within the context of ASSSD, these are still great performance numbers. Once again, if we put that into perspective, we look at the more expensive drive and we go for a larger 5 gigabyte read-write test, we can see with the A90 on the left and the A95 on the right that you can see where that extra money goes. You can see where that extra hardware has gone and worked a lot harder for a much higher score. Still, nonetheless, if we look at SSDs of a similar architecture to this, such as the Sabrent Rocket PCIe 4, and this time look at that same scoring, so we go there and we compare them side by side, we can see that this SSD exceeds it in almost every single way. So again, in terms of ASSSD, this SSD done very, very well, and once again, a lot of boxes were ticked. Indeed, if we look at the performance benchmarks there from the Sabrent from a previous test, we can see that the performance figures are quite comparable, although, as mentioned, as soon as you hit 16 gig, look at the way those IOPS drop as the oversaturation kicks in, and that is a consistent problem in a lot of these tests that utilize this E16 controller. So moving away, actually before we move away from ASSSD, what am I saying? What we want to do now is get the IOPS there on screen. Let's bring those up. And you can see, you look at all of the IOPS, and again, very comparable, sitting there in peaking close to 700,000. And again, if we look at the official pages, I'm not sure the official pages mention IOPS here, but we've already mentioned that in our review linked in the comments. And again, those are all fairly consistent and comparable numbers there. So if we come out of ASSSD and then go into our final check, which is AJA, it's worth highlighting once again that AJA, don't look at the big numbers because, again, this isn't really how these tests are being conducted. If we bring that there, what we want to look at is the graphs at the bottom. We're looking for how many drops we saw, and as you can see, as you go into the larger file types, the drops are more recurrent, but again, that's unavoidable in this kind of test. What I will say is, again, the write captures there consistently at the 4,500 mark, and the read or playback factors comfortably in the 4,100 mark, dipping, getting closer and closer into 4,200. And again, this is exactly what I would expect and want from an SSD of this architecture, and is certainly comparable to other Phison E16 controller SSDs. Now, Of course, what we've been looking at here today is a PC benchmark. We are reviewing this, and right now I see no reason to doubt the claims that the brand has made about its performance. Of course, we will be testing it on a PS5 very soon, and of course in the PS5 that is going to be a real test for this drive. The reason being that when we look at the performance of this drive, which on paper is still a lower radius than the recommended 5,500 megabytes, as you can see, they themselves have shown off here that if you put this SSD inside a PS5, the PS5's own very unique benchmark does show that it does go high, with them rating it at 5,600 as the benchmark provided by the system. But of course, stay tuned for my PS5 performance testing and inevitable comparison of these three SSDs very soon. I hope you found this review helpful. If you have, click like. If you want to learn more about this SSD and more information on these tests and more statistical and benchmark information that I recorded during our test, go to the article linked in the description where we fully reviewed this drive. There's a link to the drive in the description, of course, if you want to get hold of it. And if you do want to learn more about this SSD or other SSDs, then do subscribe to the channel. We talk about pretty much any SSD out there, regardless of whether it's for gamer, content creation, NAS, enterprise, SAN, flash, or more. So stay tuned for those. But otherwise, take advantage of the free advice section of NAS Compares. It's linked to the description, genuinely free, manned by two humans, me and Eddie the web guy. Why not use it? I will see you next time.